What are some of dark events happened in history not many people know about? By Ask Reddit.
In the early 80s, Bayer knowingly sold millions of dollars worth of HIV and hepatitis-tainted medications to Asia and Latin America. These countries didn't have laws to prevent the proliferation of tainted DG. Thousands of people died as a result. It was hardly mentioned on any news platforms. https://udo.be/UJF7MTFJTBW.
Oddly enough, they don't list that particular event in their otherwise fairly detailed history. https://www.bayer.com/and/history/1974-1988 Disgusting.
Once in the 70s, a film crew was filming an episode of The $6 Million Man, and they were shooting at an amusement park funhouse kind of thing. A stagehand was moving what he thought was a prop wax figure on a noose, only for one arm to fall off, revealing human flesh and bone underneath. After an autopsy, it was revealed to be the 60-something-year-old corpse of an old Wild West outlaw that had been taxidermied to an extent. Edit, thanks for the award. A lot of Sam O'Nella fans. Hi.
To be specific, it was the corpse of Elmer McCurdy, the "You'll Never Take Me Alive" guy.
Wait, what? Who did the taxidermy and how did it end up at the amusement park? He was an executed criminal. Which I guess people back then saw as exempting them from any obligation to treat his corpse with respect. So it became a carnival attraction. Over the years, public taste for such exhibits waned, and at some point it got stuck in a haunted house as just another prop, then forgotten. From memory and some conjecture, I read about the case before, but I couldn't cite sources or anything.
Fun fact. That is sorta what outlaw means. It means you are now deemed to be outside of the protections that any jurisdiction's law has for you. Like the right to a trial and whatnot, which is why even any person killing them was legal. They killed someone who had no protections from the law. The whole concept of outlaw is now considered heavily unconstitutional, obviously.
The ideal maternity home here in Canada. From the 1920s till the 1940s, they took in babies from unwed mothers and they were selling them especially to desperate Jewish families in New Jersey. Adoption was illegal in the US back then. It was later discovered that the people who ran this business would starve their unmarketable babies by feeding them only molasses and water. The babies would last around 2 weeks on this diet. They put the corpses in wooden boxes often used for butter, and that's why the victims are called the butterbox babies. The boxes were either buried on the property or at sea or burned in the home furnace. The parents who gave their child to this maternity home would go back and see how their child is doing, but were told the child has died when in fact it had been sold to adopting parents. Between 400 and 600 died in that home and at least 1,000 were adopted, but sadly, the adopted babies often suffered from diseases because of the unsanitary conditions and lack of care at the home.
Oh, kinda like the mother and baby home in Ireland.
The New London School Explosion. On the afternoon of the 18th of March, 1937, the shop teacher at the school in New London, TX, turned on an electric sander. Unbeknownst to him, there was a massive natural gas leak under the school. The sander sparked, which ignited the gas and caused a massive explosion that killed almost 300 students and teachers. It was absolutely horrific. The force of the explosion was so great that a 2-ton block of concrete crushed a car parked 200 feet away. This event is actually why natural gas has a smell now. They started adding it after the explosion so that something like this couldn't ever happen again. My grandfather was actually one of the survivors of the explosion. He never talked about it, even to his own family, so I didn't really know too much about it, other than the fact that he'd survived, until after his death. Toward the end of his life, he'd suffered a series of strokes that left him pretty physically incapacitated, so my dad had given him a voice-activated tape recorder and suggested maybe he could record his memoirs for his grandkids to listen to someday. As it turns out, he did. We have hours and hours of cassette tapes of him telling the story of his, actually very interesting, life, including a big section on the New London school explosion. For the sake of everyone's privacy, I'll call my grandfather Papa and use an initial for anyone else. Papa was in 8th grade when it happened, in his English class at about 3 p.m. on a Thursday afternoon. At the beginning of class, Papa and his buddy T had been messing around and being loud in the back of the classroom, as 8th grade boys often do. His teacher, Miss M, had enough of their disruptions and made Papa switch seats with another student. He moved into the girl's desk in the front row, and she moved back into his desk in the back of the room. When the school exploded, they were taking a test on the book Ivanhoe. Papa was knocked out for a short time, and when he woke up, he couldn't see anything because the dust was so thick. He looked down and saw that his pencil had blown clear through his hand. When the dust cleared, he saw that the whole back of the room was gone. I won't go into details, but there were bodies, and parts of bodies, everywhere. The students in the front half of the room survived. The students in the back half did not. That included Papa's friend T and the little girl who'd been forced to take Papa's desk because of his misbehavior at the beginning of class. If he hadn't been acting up, he would have been killed and she would have lived. He carried the guilt of her death until the day he died. Papa's classroom was on the 2nd floor. There wasn't any way to get to the room other than the open cavity of the explosion. After the few seconds of initial shock wore off, he and another classmate jumped into action. They were the only 2 kids in the class who hadn't been badly injured. They made a tourniquet out of a sock and a shoelace for a girl with a severe injury to her arm and dug out their teacher, who was alive, but badly injured. By then, men were running up underneath the hole, so Papa and the other boy started lowering the injured to them. Then those who could walk, including Papa, climbed down. He ran off to look for his older brother, B, to see if he was okay. As it turned out, B had been supposed to be in geometry class. However, he and his buddy had snuck out to go fishing. The explosion happened as they were opening the door to head out to the parking lot. The force of the blast sent them tumbling head over foot across the lot. They were both banged up and dazed, but they survived. The rest of their geometry class was killed. I don't know that there's a moral in the fact that both my grandfather and his brother survived because they were misbehaving that day. I do know that it weighed very heavily on both of them for the rest of their lives. There's a lot more to his story about the day and the aftermath, most of it absolutely horrific, but I won't go into all of it here. A few small tidbits though. Papa and the boy who helped him rescue the other students from their classroom were both awarded medals and certificates of valor for their actions that day. Nearly every family in town lost a child, some all of their children. I'm sure you can imagine the extreme toll this took on everyone's mental health. Papa described New London in the months following the explosion as a town with no children. To help with the healing process, the oil companies actively recruited families with kids to transfer in, so that there was some sense of normalcy when school started again in the fall. Papa had played French horn in the school band. However, when school started up again, he was asked to switch to trumpet, as the entire trumpet section had been killed. A few years later, my grandfather went on to fight in World War II, and he saw some of the worst conflict in the Pacific, including PLU and the liberation of Manila. But he said that nothing he saw during the war was ever as bad as what he saw the day of the explosion. I'm always amazed that more people don't know about it. It was major international news at the time. Edit, holy cow. I'm overwhelmed by the amount of interest this has brought. Thank you for all of the awards and comments. To address a couple of things people mentioned in the comments, there is a small museum at the site of the explosion in New London. If you're ever out that way, I do recommend checking it out. It is very well done and incredibly moving. My grandfather's story, while amazing, is just one of many that day. A couple people mentioned the telegram from Hitler. Yes, it's there at the museum. This was a few years before he came into full power, but he was an up-and-coming political figure in Germany at the time. I looked it up online. The original is in German, but the translation reads, "On the occasion of the terrible explosion at New London, Tex, which took so many young lives, I want to assure Your Excellency of my and the German people's sincere sympathy. Adolf Hitler, German Reichschancellor." I don't know the details, but I do know from some things my grandmother said, that Papa had some PTSD, both from the explosion and the war. We did get the recordings converted to digital files, which we have stored in several safe locations. A number of years ago I undertook the project of transcribing everything and putting together a book of my grandfather's total memoirs. In addition to the school explosion, he really lived a fascinating life. As a little kid, he was present for one of the most famous circus disasters of all time, the Corsicana Elephant Rampage, and he saw some of the fiercest action in the Pacific as an engineer for the Army Air Force during WW2. He also went from being the dirt poor son of an oil field worker to a pretty successful salesman. Later in life, at the same time my dad went to graduate school, Papa decided to go back to school and get his master's as well, which led to a career shift to become a college professor, and he taught in both Louisiana and Hong Kong. He was really a very interesting guy. Sadly, he had his 2 strokes when I was pretty young, and he died when I was 14, so all of my memories of him are of a pretty ill man in a wheelchair. Working on transcribing his memoirs, I feel like I got to know him better after his death than I ever did in life. I am so thankful for that. I compiled the memoirs into a book that we published just for family members. In addition to my grandfather's personal photographs, he kept a camera with him all throughout the war. There are a number of pictures that I pulled from online, so we couldn't publish it as it is due to copyright issues. But maybe someday I will go back and reformat everything to submit to the Library of Congress or for wider distribution. You want a happy story about him to help counter the explosion? This is a good one. Happy Smiley. At the start of WW2, while he was in basic training, a girl named Kitty sent her brother Keith a goofy picture of herself splashing around in the creek behind their family farm in TX. The picture of Kitty caught the attention of Keith's bunkmate, Papa, who decided to write Kitty a smart alecky note of his own, jokingly criticizing her manners for showing her ugly bare feet in public. Kitty was not amused. She wrote him a scathing letter, and received a very apologetic note from Papa in response. This began a written correspondence that continued throughout the war. Papa wrote faithfully from some of the most remote, dangerous locations in the Pacific. She sent him news of the home front and taunted him with descriptions of fried chicken dinners. He sent her pictures of crocodiles and told her of the orphaned children he cared for after the liberation of Manila. When Papa came back to the US in 1946, he made a trip out to the farm to see his old friend Keith and to finally meet Kitty face to face. That was on a Friday. They were engaged the following Wednesday and were happily married for over 50 years. Edit #2 for a typo. Edit #3, u/the_essayist_8 brought this video clip to my attention, and it's a pretty good account of the event. There are first-hand survivor stories, including one quite similar to my grandfather's situation, only this man traded seats with another student so that he could sit near the girl he liked. He survived, the other student did not. Worth a watch, but be warned that it's pretty heartbreaking. https://u2.b/akt01p3djrw. Having to carry a memory of a girl that died in my place because I was clowning around would F me up for life. No wonder he didn't talk about it. Sadly, but understandably, the girl's parents apparently very much saw her death as my grandfather's fault. That's a lot of weight for a 13-year-old kid to carry. But there are a lot of stories like that. There's a little museum at the site now, and I remember reading another account of a boy who traded seats with his friend so that he could sit next to a girl he liked. When the explosion happened, his friend was killed. The whole thing just devastated a generation of children.
What a terrible tragedy to witness as a child. Your grandfather sounds like he was a wonderful man, going and helping those who were injured during the explosion.
Wow. Your grandfathers sound amazing. Thank you for sharing.
The Halifax Explosion. Regarded by many as the biggest man-made explosion prior to the invention of the atomic bomb. A ship laden with explosives collided with another vessel in Halifax Harbor. The resulting explosion flattened much of the city's downtown core, killing roughly 2,000 and injuring 9,000. The blast is said to have temporarily displaced the water in the harbor, forming a tsunami that reached up to 15 meters high, surging over the wreckage of the waterfront. The following day, Halifax was hit by a blizzard that dumped 40 centimeters of snow on top of the city, further complicating rescue efforts. The city is also home to a cemetery where many victims of the Titanic were laid to rest. It is said that the body identification system developed at the time of the Titanic's sinking in 1912 aided efforts to identify victims of the Halifax explosion in 1917.
Hold up the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor heading for Pier 6, and will explode. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys. Vincent Coleman, train dispatcher, his last words. His sacrifice stopped a train carrying around 100 people from approaching Halifax, and is sending the message to as many stations as possible, hoping one of them would relay it in time, spread the word of the disaster before it even happened, meaning emergency forces mobilized sooner than they would have otherwise. On a more heartwarming note, one of the cities that rushed to Halifax's aid was Boston. Halifax has always had a big Christmas tree market, and ever since then, every year, they send a special one to Boston as thanks. And every year, Boston makes it the city's official tree.
I live in Boston, and the Christmas tree tradition is the reason I've heard about the Halifax explosion before. I thought I heard that people in Boston could hear the explosion, but I haven't found anything to back that up, so I might be mistaken.
Didn't the ship's anchor fly halfway across the province?
It flew about 2.5 miles across the city, and landed in what is now a park. There's even a monument set up with a 1,140-pound anchor shaft still there on display. I think there might be other sites around the city where more parts from the ships landed, but the anchor is definitely the most well-known.
Bystander, oh no, this giant anchor is in our park. What should we do? City official, you mean premium anchor statue? Well, I mean, yeah. It is a problem that solved itself.
To be fair, such events deserve a monument. Even without all the death and damage. And big ship anchor that flies 25 miles, 4 kilometers, and lands in a park is insane.
My uncle was injured in that at age 3. When the blast occurred, he was watching the fire in front of a window, which shattered into his face. A lot of people lost eyes, about 3,000, just that way. My uncle would periodically pull glass fragments out of his face until he was 14 years old, as they slowly worked to the surface. A book on this event is called The Town That Died.
There's a surprising amount of people that don't know about the Rwanda Genocide that happened pretty recently, like when Bill Clinton was president. Basically there were two types of Rwanda natives, the Hutus and Tutsis. The Hutus believed the Tutsis were invaders of land that was theirs, and after the assassination of the Rwandan leader, who was a Hutu, the Hutus were ordered to chop down the tall trees, which meant kill the Tutsis. The differences between Hutus and Tutsis were that Hutus were supposedly darker skinned, shorter in stature, and had shorter faces. That's why the Tutsis were called tall trees. The events that followed killed so many Tutsis, yet the UN was stingy to call it a genocide. They never liked using that term because of its association with World War II and the Nazis. It wasn't until very recently that the killings stopped. To this day, Hutus and Tutsis that survived the genocide speak at events side by side, speaking about how terrible the events were.
It gets worse when you hear about the churches. The Hutus told the Tutsis that they would be safe in a church, then went to the churches to murder them all. There was so many they had to take shifts because they couldn't kill all the Tutsis before getting too tired. It gets worse though. Pregnant women would get cut open, and any kid born or unborn that was small would get picked up and slammed against a wall until they died. I don't know if this was Rwanda or somewhere else, but they also took girls from schools, and when their family went to pick them up they would light the girls on fire to see who their parents were and then kill them all.
Humans can be absolutely disgusting.
In my family's region in Africa, they used to carry out the death penalty by snakebite. Just a snakebite to each ankle, and then letting the man spend his remaining time with his family before he died, under supervision. I thought it sounded sort of humane in a way, like our lethal injections, but apparently they say it was one of the most horrific ways that existed.
The most horrific part is that your family watches this death. Letting the man spend his remaining time with his family here really means making him die a slow, agonizing death in front of his family.
Man, that makes it a whole lot worse actually.
Do you know why it was one of the most horrific ways to die? What happens after they get bit?
According to Sinai, whether the snake is venomous or not, the area around the wound is likely to be itchy, painful and swollen. Venomous bites may also lead to nausea, vomiting, numbness, weakness, paralysis, and difficulty breathing. It depends on the snake they used, but long story short, it hurts the entire time you die, which may take up to a week.
A week.
7 days.
Good bot?
Depends on the snake. Some have primarily neurotoxic compounds in their venom, some have hemotoxins, or it can be both. Anyway, they are very painful, either because they affect nerve cells directly or because they cause inflammation and necrosis. Hemotoxic venom clots blood like in this video.
To add to crepuscular_animals statement, great name BTW, Africa is home some pretty fearsome venomous snakes. Examples being the black mamba, Gabon viper, 2-inch long fangs and massive venom sacs, the boomlang, and the bush viper. These are all fearsome snakes, and all for their own reasons.
Thank you. Yep, people think that Australia takes the cake in dangerous reptiles department, and while ounce really has the most venomous ones, African vipers are also deadly and often more aggressive. I've heard black mamba can even chase a person who is trying to back off instead of slithering away as snakes normally do.
In college I considered joining the Peace Corps. They have former volunteers come and give talks about their experience. A young woman who had served in one of the Western African countries was asked to speak about the dangers she encountered. She began by saying that she had become close to people in her village, and then she visibly changed. She went on to tell of the horror of one of her friends in the village who had been bitten by a green mamba and that he died from the bite. She said the snake had attacked him. We were just innocent, naive, happy college students, and her story was so real and severe that there were moans of sadness from us. She cried. It was awful for us. I'll never forget her. I like skunks. Crepuscular.
My co-worker got stung by an Arizona bark scorpion. The sensation is described like electricity constantly shooting through the affected area. Not usually fatal. Venomous snake can also begin to shut down respiratory functions, and other organ functions I would imagine, probably paired with intolerable pain all over.
I've been stung by bark scorpions twice in my life. The first time was on my bum. I was a teenager then and don't quite remember it too well, but the second time I woke up to what felt like someone burning me with a cigarette that shot out electric currents on the back of my knee. That's the only way I can describe it. I fell out of bed and thought I was paralyzed and crawled to the kitchen before I realized what actually happened and that I could actually walk.
My grandson is 9. Ever since he has been old enough to talk to, I have tried impress on him that scorpion stings hurt like holy hell, for hours, but they won't kill you, here in Oklahoma. I don't want him to get zapped by one and think he's dying. An ex of mine got stung by one and was flat out bawling from the pain and was scared to death.
The sad case of Oda Benga. He was a pygmy boy from the Congo who was essentially captured and brought to the USA to be displayed in freak shows. He had undergone tribal customs such as having his teeth filed into points before his capture. He eventually got out of the carnivals and dreamed of returning to Africa, then WWI happened, making the trip impossible for the foreseeable future. He committed suicide by gunshot.
Not only was he in a freak show, but he was also put in the zoo, sharing an enclosure with apes. Skeptical Smiley. The death of Roger Williamson, at the 1973 Dutch Grand Prix. In the 1970s era of Formula One, the cars weren't far off from being an overpriced metal coffin on wheels, surrounded by highly flammable fuel, and during the Dutch Grand Prix, this became painfully obvious indeed. Roger Williamson crashed out after a tire puncture, and his car came to rest upside down, with him trapped inside. He was not seriously hurt by the crash, but then the fuel tank ignited and the car burst into flames. Another driver named David Purley was behind Williamson when the crash occurred, and he saw the whole crash unfold. Purley stopped his car on the other side of the track, ran across an active racetrack, and proceeded to try and save Williamson's life. This is where the dark part of it comes in, and depending on your sensibilities, downright outrageous and disgraceful. None of the trackside marshals had any fireproof equipment, which prevented any of them from helping Purley to right the burning car. They also had a grand total of one fire extinguisher between them, which was incapable of putting out the flames. Additionally, not a single other driver who saw the calamity stopped to help, despite police frantic waving to them to try and get anyone to assist in saving Williamson's life. Meanwhile, race control decided not to halt the race despite a flaming wreck being present on track, and it took almost 10 minutes before the fire engine arrived on site, by which point, Williamson had asphyxiated from the smoke and flames. As soon as the fire was out, they simply put a blanket over the burned-out car and continued racing. Later on, other drivers and the race controllers would claim that they assumed Williamson's car was actually Purley's, and that there was no one at risk at that time, something that the many hundreds of people within the grandstands would strongly disagree with. Williamson burned to death right in front of a grandstand packed with spectators, who all got a front row seat to watching Williamson die before their very eyes. So there you have it, a young, promising driver slowly being burned alive over the course of 10 minutes, a second driver desperately trying in vain to save his life, a group of marshals woefully under-equipped for the job, indifferent drivers, incompetent race control, and a disaster which shook Formula One to its core. As a result of this debacle, changes were made to try and avoid this type of event occurring again in the future. The biggest change was the mandate that marshals should wear fireproof clothing, and it was also noted that drivers were more willing to stop at accident sites to assist in rescuing fellow drivers. This was most clearly seen during the 1976 German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring Nordschleife, where Guy Edwards, Harold Ertl, Brett Lunger, and Arturo Matteo all pulled over to assist in getting Niki Lauda out of his burning Ferrari, after the infamous crash that took him out of the German, Austrian, and Dutch Grands Prix.
This is what was so scary about Bahrain last year. knowing what had happened and no cameras on the wreck. So glad Grosjean came out relatively unscathed.
I saw that crash live, and it was terrifying. I was massively relieved to see Grosjean emerging from the flames and into the ambulance on his feet.
I saw it on TV the moment it happened. I kind of froze as soon as a fireball appeared on the corner of the screen. That man emerged from the flames like a phoenix, pretty much was born again after that. He literally survived crashing into a wall at well over 200 kilometers per hour, having his car split in half and being engulfed in fire for a worrying amount of time, and managed to jump out by himself with a few bruises and burnt hands. Truly shows the safety of Formula One nowadays.
I thought I had just watched someone die live on TV. Thousands of hours of work went into engineering and designing the safety mechanisms in place that allowed him to walk away with minor burns.
On the same note, the deaths of other drivers, like Tom Price. First off, let's go back to 1977. Specifically the 15th of March, at the South African Grand Prix. Renzo Zorzi pulls off to the left side of the main straight, having issues with his fuel metering unit. Zorzi had trouble getting his oxygen tube disconnected, and as his engine caught fire, 2 track marshals came rushing in. Out of nowhere, Price's car, going 270 km per hour, hits one of the 2 marshals, a 19-year-old who was carrying a fire extinguisher. The marshal who was struck was killed instantly. Price was almost instantly killed when the fire extinguisher hits his helmet and wrenched it upwards. The track marshal was so badly mutilated that it took all of the track marshals gathering together to realize who the deceased was. Edit, I figured I'd mention some other notable racing deaths that were horrifying. 1982, Gordon Smiley, a 36-year-old Indy 500 driver, went out for qualifying. His car began to oversteer while rounding the 3rd turn, resulting in him trying to correct it by steering right. His tires suddenly gained grip, sending his car flying directly across the track and into the wall nose first at nearly 200 miles per hour. The crash destroyed the chassis, causing the fuel tank to explode. Smiley's exposed body, alongside the debris of his car, was sent flying into the catch fence and then back onto the track. He was practically dismembered, and died at the scene.
Yet, he basically vaporized as soon as the car hit him. I don't recommend it, but you can watch the footage on YouTube. The Viphalm Experiment. Sweden are mostly known as a not very scary country, with good and mostly accessible dental care. Well, part of how that came to be is this: https://n.wikipedia.org/wiki/viphalm_experiments. Hey, you are institutionalized and suffering and powerless, let's make your teeth rot out of your skull. For science.
Many younger folks may hold that view of Sweden. For us slightly older and who have done our homework, we know Sweden's closet is bursting with skeletons. Good old eugenics in it.
Sweden officially closed their last eugenics program in 2012 IIRC.
Excuse me. Edit, I'm clearly reacting to the year. Quit making you wanted them to keep it open, jokes, you edgelords.
Bro, there are still so many people that want eugenics today.
I think it was Radiolab that did a series on IQ, and the episode about genetics said they could nail down the height of the embryo to within an inch 100% of the time. But when it comes down to intelligence, there are so many different factors they can't, yet, really determine genetically which embryo will be smarter than another. If they ever crack that code, I bet there will be some sort of arms race to create superhumans between China and the West, and it'll definitely only lead to some crazy antics.
Jesus, so that's why I used to only get candy on Saturdays as a child. Never knew that the source of the tradition was so sinister. Anyone who's familiar with Mary, Queen of Scots, most likely knows that she was beheaded, but many people don't know how she was beheaded. My APUSH teacher told my class the story, and it's probably one of the most simultaneously interesting, funniest, and saddest executions in history. The first thing to note was that Mary wore a red dress rather than a white one for a very specific reason. After the execution of a royal or high-class person, commoners would often tear off blood-stained fabric from their clothing solely to flex that they got their hands on the blood of a noble. With red fabric, it would be difficult to see actual blood on the dress. Smart move on Mary's end. During the actual execution, it was said that Mary's executioner was not very experienced and actually missed the initial swing, jamming the axe or whatever weapon they used into the back of her head rather than through her neck. This didn't kill her yet, though, and she instead made some sort of medieval olden time exclamation that can be roughly translated to "goddamn." Edit. After the executioner was done, he picked up her head by the hair, not knowing it was a wig, and the head fell out and rolled onto the floor. Thanks plug_5 and Moyochi for reminding me. After Mary was properly killed, her body was left for public viewing, but the audience was surprised to see her red dress start to rustle before allowing Mary's small terrier dog to climb out from underneath. Tragically, the dog refused to leave the body and eventually passed away after staying at the same spot for a lengthy amount of time. History buffs, please feel free to make any corrections, as I heard this story a while ago and probably made a few errors in my recalling. Smiley face. TL. Dr. Mary, Queen of Scots, avoided crazy memorabilia savers at her execution with a very intelligent move, got shanked in the head during a failed attempt. The executioner dropped her head onto the floor, and had her dog in her dress with her the entire time.
She wore a red petticoat, as a form of FU to Elizabeth I. It represents both martyrs and AWS in Catholicism, which is truly why she was beheaded, avoidance of a Catholic monarch on England's throne after the Reign of Terror, courtesy of Elizabeth's older sister, Mary Tudor aka Bloody Mary, who was the granddaughter of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. They are responsible for the Spanish Inquisition. I could go on. Interesting stuff.
You left out the part where the executioner picked up her head to show the crowd when he was done, but didn't realize she was wearing a wig, so he dropped her head on the floor.